in disbelief. You know, it may sound a little cheesy, but at the end of the day, I fundamentally believe in public service. I believe it can be a force for good, a force that gives people opportunity, a force that is people-powered, that can lift our neighbors up and instill hope, a force that meets the toughest challenges of our constituents, and that is why I am struck with disbelief. Disbelief because if you believe these things like I do, which I would argue most of my colleagues here do, why would you be jamming this bill through? At a time when Wisconsin families are asking us to take on the high cost of living and let them have a fair shot at success, Republicans are raising costs and making an already unfair tax system even worse. My Republican colleagues are not using their time and energy to go after greedy corporations, not to lower the cost of housing, and not to expand access to affordable health care, but rather they are instead forging ahead with a bill that will kick millions of Americans off their health insurance, jack up prices for care for millions more, and literally take food off the tables of hungry families. Look, I was on the same ballot as Donald Trump last year. I heard the same concerns from my constituents that he did. Families needed some breathing room. My Republican colleagues often say that this president's victory gave him a mandate. Well, then, the president and I got the same mandate: to lower costs and give people the opportunity to live a steady and comfortable life. But in response, the difference could not be more stark. I'm actually working to do something about it. And this bill, the landmark bill from this president and the Republican Party, does just the opposite and will raise costs for families. One of the biggest cost drivers I hear about is health care. And so instead of standing up to big drug companies to lower prescription drug costs, and instead of building on the Affordable Care Act to expand access to health care coverage, this bill actually terminates coverage for Americans. In fact, 17 million Americans will be kicked off either Medicaid or the Affordable Care Act because of this bill. That is like stripping health care coverage from the entire populations of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa combined. And these aren't just numbers. These are people. These are people who have stories, and they matter. I should know, after battling a childhood illness, I became one of those Americans labeled as having a pre-existing health condition. And insurance companies were legally able to deny me coverage. But because of the Affordable Care Act, we changed that. And we gave families like mine hope. Hope that they can get health care at a price they can afford and sleep well at night knowing they have coverage. Medicaid has given that same hope for generations to some of our most vulnerable neighbors. But with this bill, my Republican colleagues are instilling fear. When we talk about Medicaid, we're talking about the elderly, people with disabilities, and children. We're talking about a single mother of 3 who is struggling to make ends meet, and so many more. I have traveled the state of Wisconsin from Superior to Racine, La Crosse to Green Bay, and everywhere in between, to hear from people who will be harmed by this bill. I have come to this very floor to share their stories, to try to help my Republican colleagues understand what this bill will mean. But it's not just the folks who need Medicaid to survive who are sounding the alarm. Take it from Dr. Abigail Wilgruber, a family medical resident in rural Wisconsin. She said this bill, quote, will deprive millions of Americans, particularly children, seniors, and individuals with disabilities, of the care they need to survive. She continued saying, these provisions will limit my ability to complete my job to the fullest, will lead to worse outcomes for patients. Or take it from Rosalanja Burbot, the executive director of an outpatient counseling center in the Fox Valley in Wisconsin, who said, and I quote, without Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements or with reduced rates, our nonprofit will struggle to survive. She continued to say, quote, I would hate to consider cutting staff or programs, but that could become our only option. We would lose the ability to serve hundreds of clients, not because the need has diminished, but because we could no longer afford to provide care without reimbursement. I have more and more of these stories from doctors, nurses, and administrators on the ground who are spelling out the absolutely dire consequences of this bill. In Wisconsin, we are already in a crisis when it comes to getting good health care in our rural communities. The system is broken, and this bill is destined to make it only worse. While health care is near and dear to my heart, there is more bad news in this bill. Republicans' big betrayal will also take food assistance, the literal means by which some people are able to put nutritious food on the table, away from them. This bill will take SNAP assistance, our nation's best way to make sure that no one goes hungry, away from more than 3 million Americans. And that leads us to the why. Republicans are making all of these cuts so that they can rig our tax code, which I must say already is deeply unfair to working families. And they would further tilt it in favor of the biggest corporations and the richest in our country. The Republican bill gives people at the top 0.1%, the richest of the rich, a tax cut of more than $250,000 every year. Yes, $250,000 a year. All the while, this bill hits working families the hardest. When taking into account the disastrous Medicaid and SNAP cuts, many working families would see their annual incomes fall by over $1,500. And it doesn't have to be this way. Yes, our system for taxes and health care are broken, but this bill is not the solution. This bill would make it harder for working families to have the opportunity to get ahead, harder for parents to get their kids health care, harder for families to put food on the table. We, Democrats and Republicans, should be working together to give some relief to workers, but instead, Republicans will choose to go it alone and vote to give the biggest corporations and the wealthy another unfair leg up. I will end with this. While I remain in disbelief and frankly disgust, I will always have hope. I have hope because it's not the people in this chamber with the power, it's the people. It's the people who will sadly feel the repercussions of this bill. It's the people who are rising up and will hold anyone who passes this disastrous bill accountable. That is where the true power is. And with that, I yield.